Last time we talked about Socrates' views on ethics as revealed in Plato's early dialogue. Today I'm going to be talking about Plato's ethical view, his more mature view as it emerges in the middle period dialogues, and in particular in the Republic. As we'll see, Plato at that stage of his thinking rejects a lot of the ideas of Socrates and ends up coming up with a rather different theory. So at the outset, let's just remind ourselves of Socrates' view. By the end of the Laches, and the same thing happens, by the way, in a variety of these other early dialogues, a really good example is the Charmides on the Greek virtue of sophrosyne, or self-control. But in any case, the idea really is that all the virtues come to the same thing. Every virtue, in the end, amounts to knowing what to do and what not to do. Knowing what's better than what. Knowing good and evil, as Socrates himself and the other participants in the dialogue describe it. And so in the end, you might take that as a definition of wisdom, knowing what to do. And then all of the others turn out to be the same. Courage, in the final analysis, is just knowing what to do. The same thing is true of piety or righteousness, of generosity, of temperance or self-control, of prudence, and so on. All of them end up being just a matter of knowing what to do. And so it turns out every virtue is really just knowing what to do. They all end up being exactly the same. Now, at first glance, that seems puzzling, because it looks as if you could be courageous without being generous, for example, or self-controlled without being particularly pious or even wise. And so it doesn't look as if these are the same. Now, one interpretation would be to say, well, they're really exactly the same thing, knowing what to do, but on the other hand, in different contexts. So courage is a matter of knowing what to do in confronting fear. And generosity, a matter of knowing what to do with respect to helping others. And self-control, knowing what to do when faced with desires or drives of your own, and so on. And so they would be the same thing in different contexts. That makes the Socratic view a little more plausible. You could say, well, then, all right, somebody could be generous without being courageous, just by virtue of knowing what to do in some contexts and not in others. And so I think the view isn't absurd. It's something you could try to defend and say, look, in the end, it's the same thing. It's just applied in different settings. But a more natural view would be to say the virtues are actually somewhat different, because being courageous is a matter of, well, actually, last time somebody came up with a really great definition. You are much better than the people Socrates happened to be discussing this with in the dialogue, and said, look, it's a matter of overcoming fear for the sake of some good. And that seems like a very plausible way of thinking about it. The person who's courageous overcomes fear for the sake of doing something good. And if you think about it in those terms, you could say, well, of course you could overcome fear for the sake of something good without being generous and, let's say, overcoming selfishness for the sake of something good, namely helping others, and so on. And so then it would look like, yeah, maybe there's some overlap here, but in general they would look different. And you'd end up with a picture more like that. Now, it could be that there's some overlap there. There's some core virtues that every virtue really requires. And so are there any things like that? Every virtue might be thought to require at least these virtues, or at least some kind of core virtue, because without that you couldn't really exhibit any virtue at all. Would there be anything like that? Yeah. Say it again. Goodness. Okay, good, yeah. In fact, later Kant is going to say there's really one ultimate virtue, having a good will. And you might say it's a question of trying to do the right thing as opposed to being utterly selfish, for example, or trying to do the wrong thing. And so you might think that at least striving for the good is something that is a core of all of these virtues. Are there any other possibilities for that? Yeah?
Conviction that the virtue is, I don't know, just conviction that the virtue is right.
Okay, good. Conviction that that's the right thing to do. In fact, those are slightly different. One is a matter of being good. The other is at least thinking you're being good, right? Striving for the good, even if you're wrong. You might be fighting, for example, in a war on the wrong side. But as long as you believe in it, you might say, you can count as virtuous in that fight. And so at least thinking you're doing the right thing might be an important core to all of these. Can you think of anything else? Yeah?
I feel like a lot of people might say wisdom.
Wisdom, okay, yeah, some degree of wisdom of knowing what you're doing. It might not be perfect wisdom, knowing what to do in every setting, but at least in this case, some degree of knowing what to do might be required. Can you think of anything else? Try to think of someone who couldn't possibly be virtuous in any respect. One way is that they can be really evil and trying to do evil. But outside of, movies with mini-me's and so on, and superheroes and stuff like that, we don't find that many people who are truly evil, luckily. Profoundly evil, more evil than normal. But think about other ways of failing. Yeah? All right, you have to have a certain kind of motive. In fact, trying to do the right thing would be one particular kind of motive. But what if just having a motive is a requirement? So in other words, you could even have a weaker version. Look, what about the person who just has no motives at all? Just walks through life more or less randomly. Why'd you do that? Well, I don't know. Just seemed like the thing to do. That sort of person, you might think, really can't have any virtue at all because they just aren't motivated by anything. They're just sort of randomly going through life. Or what about the person, go ahead.
Being in debt or ignorant of knowledge.
All right, if you're utterly ignorant of what's going on around you, you might say it's impossible to have any virtue. Look, if you really are completely confused about what's going on, I'm thinking here maybe of Don Quixote or something. Actually, it looks like Don Quixote can have some virtues, even if he's really confused and thinks that windmills are opposing knights and so on. But there might be certain kinds of ignorance anyway that would really prevent you from being virtuous, because you really don't have a clue what you're doing. Here's another possibility. The person who is so distracted, for example, that they can't carry out any course of action. There are the enemy soldiers coming over the pass. He's there, ready to defend his post, and all of a sudden, ha, a squirrel! This goes running after the squirrel. Somebody who really is not able to persist in some way, who is incredibly distractible or just cannot stick with a thought for very long, might be a sort of person who really is incapable of exercising these virtues. So there might be some virtues of rational action that are just there. If somebody's totally irrational, if somebody really can't persist in any course of action, if they aren't even trying to do anything good, and so on, we might say, yeah, all the rest fall apart. Yes?
Empathy.
Empathy, okay, right. If a person doesn't have any degree of empathy for another person, it might be impossible for them to exercise at least certain of the virtues, and maybe any virtue at all. So it strikes me as just an interesting question. Are there certain virtues at the core there where all of these overlap? And basically there are things that you would have to have in order to have any other virtue at all. In any event, Plato and Socrates don't have a lot to say about that. That's just something I'm interested in. Yeah? Her point is that the core virtue, and whether or not there are any of these core virtues, could depend on how we define individual virtues. And indeed, courage is a good example. Does the courageous person have to be seeking the good, or do they have to be seeking at least what they think is good? It will matter when we think about soldiers fighting for the wrong cause, for example, or a criminal who is carrying out a very daring plan for a crime and doing something wrong, doing something evil, but nevertheless doing it with a kind of dramatic flair, overcoming fear. Does that criminal count as courageous? If we think about perceiving good, it might be that the criminal thinks it'll be good to rob that bank, and so can count as courageous, or the soldier on the wrong side thinks he's doing the right thing. But maybe even that isn't required. What about the person who knows he's doing evil, but is a highly courageous villain? Could there be a courageous villain who is actually trying to do the wrong thing? So it will matter how we define these things in our search for that common core. And it will matter a lot, for example, about whether seeking the good or seeking what a person thinks is good, or at least seeking something, is going to count as something that's required for any virtue at all. Well, let's take a look at Socrates' definition. This idea that any virtue, like courage, is really in the end wisdom, just knowing good and evil, knowing what to do and what not to do. We talked about some problems last time, and so we could think about whether or not, you might say, you could be virtuous without knowing good and evil, but also whether you could know good and evil without being virtuous. So he's making two claims here. One is, look, in order to be virtuous, you've got to know what to do. And secondly, that if you know what to do, you're virtuous. And so there are two ways of thinking about this claim and trying to analyze it. Is it true that you can't be virtuous without knowing good and evil? And is it true that if you do know good and evil, you're going to end up virtuous? Well, last time actually we talked about one of these problems a little bit. But let me go back to the first question. Do you have to know what to do in order to be virtuous? Is there some knowledge required? In other words, is wisdom one of those things that's required to have any virtue at all? Maybe wisdom is in that core. Could you be virtuous but not very wise? Yeah.
I guess it depends on whether you think like virtue is only through action, or if it can be like your inner self as well.
Ah, good. Exactly. It has to do with that balance between the internal and the external aspects of this. The extent to which it's a matter of behavior or action, and the extent to which it's a matter of intention. Suppose somebody is very generous, for example, naturally, but it's not because they have any knowledge of it. They're just like that. You know, you say, hey, gosh, I'm hungry. Do you have an extra $1 for a hamburger? Yeah, sure. And they don't really think, you know, okay. It's just natural. Like, yeah, whatever. That sort of person might do lots of generous things, and yet you could say, well, are they really virtuous? Now, if your answer is, yeah, they're virtuous. Look, they're doing all these virtuous things. They're doing all these generous things. They're helping people out without much regard for themselves. Then you could say, well, no particular knowledge is required. They're just sort of naturally like that. On the other hand, the claim here is, well, there's a difference between that person and the person who actually knows that that's the right thing to do and is doing it because it's the right thing. Think about people and their natural dispositions. Some people have natural dispositions toward a certain kind of behavior. I think I mentioned to you once that I was a very sweet baby. I was just happy all the time as a baby. And my brother was a miserable baby. He just cried all the time as a baby. In a certain sense, for me to be quiet and a good baby was easy. I wasn't doing it because I thought it was the right thing to do. It wasn't like, oh, mommy needs sleep, I better be quiet. I was just kind of like, I'm never bored. I mean, even as a baby, I'd be there looking at the ceiling, and it's like, wow, that's cool, you know? And so I was the sort of person who was just kind of like, yeah, you know, whatever. I was always happy. And it really was just a natural disposition. It wasn't because of any degree of knowledge. And so you might say, look, some people, remember Mencius was arguing everybody's naturally good, Xunzi, everybody's naturally evil, and then Wang Chung, an empiricist, says, well, look, some people are naturally good and other people are naturally evil. But here's the point. It might be that some people do generous things just naturally without really having to think about it, without having to know anything. And other people do virtuous actions only as a result of knowledge and only as a result of trying to do the right thing. Yeah?
But are these actions virtuous once you have intent?
Is it really virtuous if you don't have intent? Yeah, what about that? Can you be virtuous without even intending to be? Yeah.
Well, because virtue is like sort of the way we interact with other people. So people don't know what your intentions are. Maybe they have
okay. Right. So here's an argument for the external view. He's saying, look, people don't know what your intentions are, and so actually when we judge people as virtuous or vicious, we're looking at what they do. We don't really know why they're doing it. Let's say you fall down, drop everything everywhere, and somebody stoops and starts helping you. Well, they're doing something nice for you, right? And you might say, hey, that's a nice thing to do. And why are they doing it? Well, you don't really know. Maybe they're trying to be nice. Maybe they're naturally nice and would be naturally helpful. Maybe they're thinking, I ought to help that person, and doing it because they think it's the right thing to do. Maybe they're trying to impress you. They're just like, that's Professor Bonham. Hey, I need something from him. I need a letter of recommendation from him, so I'll help. Or maybe, anyway, we don't really know. Or maybe it's kind of, I'll befriend him and stab him in the back. Whatever it is, we can't tell that intention. And so, how much does it matter? At one level, you might say, look, I don't care why you're doing it. You're just helping me. You're being helpful. That's a virtuous thing to do. Now, whether you're a virtuous person, that's a different question. But is it a virtuous action? You might think it's just a question of the external aspects of the action. Now, last time we were saying that's not really true. What about the person who stands and fights for the completely wrong reason? So there's an argument for the internal side too. But at least one direction would say, I don't care why you're doing it, and so actually I don't care about your mental state. I don't care whether you know what to do. All I care about is whether you're doing the right thing. You wanted to get in it.
Yeah, it was just the last thing that you just said was what I was going to ask about. Isn't virtue meant to be, isn't its intent to be for self-fulfillment, for virtue. It's not something you're doing for other people or as a facade or anything to like impress other people. Virtue is for yourself.
Ah, okay, she's saying, isn't virtue something for yourself? In other words, being a virtuous person is something that's good for you, is something that fulfills you. It's not primarily done for somebody else. Now, that's an interesting question. Why be virtuous is an important philosophical question, but also, what motivates a virtuous person to be virtuous? Is it some concern for other people? Is it instead a desire for self-improvement or fulfillment or something like that? Is it a religious sense of trying to please God? Or maybe just trying to please other people around you? All of those are questions that we would have to settle to really know whether he's right about this side of the question. So I think we're not going to settle this today, but I want you to see it's a complicated question. Does the person who is virtuous have to know what they're doing? And doing it, or do they have to be doing it for the right reason and so on? I think it's not so easy to say. It really depends what motivates a person to be virtuous and what kind of motivation is required. To what extent we say virtue is a matter of just doing something, or at least virtuous action is a matter of just doing the right sort of thing. And to what extent we insist, no, it has to be done for the right reason, with the right motive or intention. And so those are complicated questions. Now, I do want to focus mostly today on the other side of it. Suppose somebody does know what to do. Do they count as virtuous? And we already saw last time a problem with that. We said, wait a minute, what about the person who knows what to do but doesn't do it? There could be times when somebody knows what to do and fails to deliver. So it looks like there's this gap between knowledge and action. Couldn't I know and not do? This is called weakness of will. In the Greek, it's akrasia. It is a matter of really giving in to temptation, knowing what you ought to do and not doing it. So we could say weakness of will could be defined in any one of a number of ways. There's subtle differences here, but I think for now it'll give you the idea. It's a matter of giving in to temptation, or knowing the better and doing the worse, or knowing what you ought to do and not doing it, or at least believing this is what you ought to do and then not doing it. There are some interesting cases of terrorists, for example, who were going to carry out terrorist attacks, had the vest filled with bombs, then get up to the checkpoint and chicken out. And it's like, what do you say about somebody like that? Did they know what was right and not do it? Well, no, it wasn't right to blow themselves in this whole checkpoint up. So that would have been a terrible thing to do. On the other hand, they thought it was the right thing to do. And they, in some cases, feel horribly guilty for not committing mass murder. And in that kind of case, you could say, well, gosh, okay, it's a matter of at least believing you ought to do something and not doing it. Now, there are some expressions of this in the literature. Ovid is the one who comes up with the phrase, knowing the better and doing the worse. I think I read for you earlier that quotation from Romans, from Paul. I don't understand my own actions. I don't do what I want, but do the very thing I hate. I can will what's right, but can't do it. For I don't do the good I want, but the evil I don't want is what I do. And he's expressing there this idea of weakness of will. I have an idea of what I want to do, but I don't do it. And so Paul says, look, I'm in some sense a stranger to myself. There is something in me that will not obey my own commands. Well, what do we say about that? It looks like a case where we've got a false positive. The person who is weak of will knows what to do, but they don't do it. And so it looks like they count as knowing good and evil, and yet it seems strange to consider them virtuous. I might say, yeah, I'm very virtuous in exercising. You say, really, how often do you exercise? Oh, hardly ever, but I want to. I think, I ought to go to the gym, but instead I watch Rick and Morty. And you go, oh, look, knowing that you want to exercise, that doesn't make you, a healthy and virtuous person. Oh, but I know what I have to do, that's all. No, that's not all that you have to do. And so there's something wrong with this. Oh, my image of the exercising person is missing. There's supposed to be a woman jogging in the middle of that. It did warn me that some images would not show. Well, this is one of them. But just pretend it's me. Okay? I know I should exercise. That's a matter of knowing no better. But I don't. Okay? I don't want to, but I don't. That's doing the worse. And so you might say, well, that's a classic case of weakness of will. Now, in this case, it's not a moral example. In this case, the ought is really just a prudential ought. It would be good for me. I don't think I have a moral obligation to exercise, although I am participating in this walk tofu thing, so I promise to do a certain amount of this. So yesterday I went to a meeting with the dean, dressed very casually in shorts and stuff, and when he said, "Why are you dressed like that?" I said, "It's October. I gotta put in my miles, man." So anyway, but here's the idea. What can Socrates say about this? He does have an answer. He's aware of the problem, and he says, look, weakness of will is impossible. There can be no such thing. A person who knew what to do would do it. Okay? Virtue is a matter, he says, of knowing good and evil. And so this envisioned scenario of somebody who knows but doesn't do, that doesn't happen. Weakness of will would have to involve knowing but not doing. But look, the person who doesn't know is the one who isn't going to do. That is to say, if you aren't doing the right thing, it's because you don't know that's the best thing for you to do. So it's not virtuous, plainly, to do the wrong thing. We don't want to have Socrates saying, oh yeah, the person who knows but doesn't do is really virtuous. He doesn't want to count the couch potato as virtuous in seeking health just because that person knows what they ought to be doing. But he does have an answer. He says, look, suppose somebody is displaying weakness of will that way. They think they should exercise, but instead, like Hans and Franz here, they are just sitting around eating French fries and drinking wine. That's a really odd combination. But anyway, the weakness of will in this case does involve knowing the good, but not doing it. He knows he should exercise, let's say, but doesn't. So what can we say? We either have to say the person is virtuous, and that just seems wrong, or we can say, aha, something else is going on. Think about the virtuous person who knows what to do and actually does it, okay? That person might be the virtuous person in this respect. They actually do the exercise. They actually do what they think they ought to do. But now, what does that tell us? Well, look, he says, ignorant, if virtue is knowledge, then vice is ignorance. The person who doesn't do what they ought to be doing doesn't know. There's something they're making a mistake about. So in a way, the thesis is this. It's not that we call the couch potato virtuous. It's that we say that person doesn't, in fact, know what to do. That person is ignorant of something. So here's his argument. Nobody would willingly choose the lesser good. And so it's absurd to think this person knows what's better and doesn't do it. If they don't do the better thing, it's because they don't know it's better. Now, at first glance, that seems really implausible. You might be dieting, for example, and think, I know I shouldn't eat that chocolate cake, but there it is. Or if you're like me, you might think, look, the faster I eat it, the faster it'll be gone and it won't be tempting me anymore. But anyway, here's what's going on, he says. We're terrible at comparing short-term and long-term goods. All of the cases that are interesting with respect to weakness of will are cases where there's a short-term benefit or harm and a long-term harm or benefit. So think about the person thinking about their long-term health and thinking, I ought to exercise. The immediate result of exercise might be for that person something unpleasant if they don't like to do it. On the other hand, there's a long-term benefit, and so they're thinking about the short-term unpleasantness for the long-term gain. Or think about the person who has to study for a philosophy exam and doesn't want to do it. Why they wouldn't want to do it, I can't imagine. But suppose they don't want to do it. There are other things they'd rather do. But they think of the long-term benefits of having a good grade on this exam, a good grade in the course, and so on, and so they do it. It's a question of short-term and long-term comparisons. And the same thing can be true of moral considerations. The person who's thinking, I should be faithful to my husband or wife, but gosh, that person's awfully good looking. Is thinking about a very short-term benefit, potentially, but weighed against the long-term harm. And so, Socrates' point is, look, we just stink at making those comparisons. We're really bad at it. And so, what some people would call a sort of, moral failing, he says, isn't so much a moral failing as just a computational failing. We're terrible at computing long-term versus short-term benefits and harms. Yeah? Oh, all right, good. There is an important other possibility here, and maybe, in fact, it's an ally of Socrates' view. You might know right and wrong, but really have trouble figuring out in a particular case what is right and wrong. In fact, it's a little bit embarrassing because, people like me who teach ethics courses sometimes get approached for advice. So here's a hard problem, ethicists, what should I do? And we ethicists tend to say, well, The utilitarian would see it this way, and the Kantian would see it this way, and Aristotle would think this, and Socrates would think this. And so, well, yeah, but like, what should I do? And we say, I don't know. So it can be very difficult in the end to apply things to a particular situation. And one of the problems here is, in a sense, the person might know in general good and evil, but to figure out in this particular case what's more important than what's more valuable than what, that could be really hard. Go on. Oh, okay, good. Yeah, I might know the right thing to do, but not have any idea how to get myself to choose that. In a way, this is Paul's problem, because Paul is saying, look, I know what I'm supposed to be doing, but I don't want to do it, and I find myself not choosing to do it. I do something else that I don't want to do. And he says, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to get myself to a point where I'm choosing the right thing. And so, to some extent, that's a question of developing willpower and understanding how to become the sort of person who makes the right choice. Well, let's take a look at Plato's view, because he thinks Socrates is really wrong about this. From Socrates' point of view, it's easy to see the answer to that question. I just have to know more. I have to develop my short-term versus long-term reasoning abilities better, and I have to get better at calculating and comparing those kinds of goods. He thinks they are comparable. I just have to learn to do it better. And so sometimes that might be the answer. I just have to learn to delay gratification, for example. I have to learn to get better about comparing those long-term and short-term things. But Plato says that's not really entirely the story. And it's because, in part, it doesn't feel right. He says, consider a case of conflict in which the person who has willpower resists his desires, and the person who's weak of will gives in to them. A person in such a situation seems to be at war with himself. And there is no sense in Socrates that that's the case. The person who is facing temptation is really in a situation, Socrates says, just trying to figure out a problem. It's like somebody gives you a complicated math problem. But one of these sides is in familiar numerical terms and the other side is using, I don't know, logarithms or something. And you're like, oh, I don't really remember. Oh, logarithms, darn, it's been years, I don't remember how that goes. And it's just that, right? Now, if you're trying to solve a problem about logarithms, you don't really feel at war with yourself, do you? I mean, it might be hard. You might think, oh yeah, what does that do? And natural logarithms, E 2.78 something, I don't remember. And, you know, you might be fussing like that, but it's not like, oh, I feel like I'm being torn apart. You're more like just trying to remember, trying to figure out the problem. And so for Socrates, there's no explanation for why somebody would feel torn apart. But think about a situation of temptation. Are there cases where you face temptation and you really do feel torn apart about it? You really feel at war with yourself? What would be a case like that? Yeah. Okay, good, you love two people, and you really feel utterly torn apart by that. There's a wonderful book about that very problem by Graham Greene called The Heart of the Matter. This guy is married, he loves his wife, but then there's a woman in the village who gets badly injured, and he nurses her back to health, and as that happens, he falls in love with her. And so it's like, I'm still in love with my wife, and I feel an obligation to my wife, but I'm really in love with this woman, and gosh, without me, I don't know if she'd have the strength to go on, and blah, blah, blah. So what does he do? He feels this obligation to his wife, this obligation to this woman, a love for his wife, a love for this other woman. So he kills himself. I don't recommend that as a way of solving moral dilemmas, by the way, but clearly he didn't just think, oh man, this is a tough problem, I can't solve it, so I'll kill myself. He felt torn apart, he felt at war with himself, and the novel is about that. It is in a way making Plato's point that this is something that tears somebody apart. It's not something that they just think, wow, that's a real stumper, I don't know what to do. It's something that's much more difficult than that. Here's a nice contrast. Suppose I offer you $5 or $10. Which would you choose? $10, right? Not hard at all. Nobody's tempted to say, well, I know the $10 would be better for me, but I think I'll just take the 5. If you're just thinking at any rate about your own welfare, you're going to say, of course the $10 is better. Now, if instead of a 10 and a 5, it were a 10 and let's say a £5 note or a €5 note, then you face this problem of the short-term and long-term, maybe, or analogous to that, where these are kind of in different units, and you say, ooh, how much is a euro worth or a pound worth? I don't know. I have to think about that one. But again, you don't feel at war with yourself. There's just a problem to be solved. If they're in the same denomination, super easy. Different, all right, problem to be solved. But now think about this. You're on a diet, and yet somebody brings donuts to the office. Okay? And there she is staring at the donuts, thinking, oh, they look so good. Maybe she's like Homer Simpson. Sprinkles, pink sprinkles. Okay, now, in this kind of situation, what do you do? Or think of the cat facing the temptation of the goldfish. Or this little guy who's remarkably like me, actually. How do I resist food temptation? First, I identify the food items I can't stop thinking about. Then I remove all sources of temptation by eating them. You are dumb. Or, a classic case. This is a painting called Temptation. And I guess the woman there is supposed to be Eve with the apple, and the little baby thinking, what you doing, Mommy? Well, anyway. Yeah. Okay, now according to Plato, the fact that we feel torn apart, we feel at war with ourselves, is a reason to think there must be different parts of the soul. He says, what sense does it make for one thing to be pushed in this direction and in that direction? He says, since the source of this is coming from us, if there were external forces, it'd be easy to understand. We could have a force on an object and an opposing force on that same object coming from outside. But here it's coming from inside. And he says, I don't see how that one thing could be generating things that pull in opposite directions. So he says there must be different parts of the soul. What does he mean by parts of the soul? I don't think it should be interpreted necessarily as some sort of religious thing or complicated thing. It's not deep metaphysics in a way. He's just saying there are different aspects of our personality. There are different parts of ourselves somehow that are pulling us in different directions, that are fighting against each other. So it might be your love for one person and your love for somebody else. Or your love for one person and your feeling of obligation to somebody else. Or the appeal of the donut and the desire to lose weight. Whatever it is some kind of tension between a thought that you don't want to do this thing, but you think you should do it. Or if you don't want to do it, at least you want to do it. Like Paul. He doesn't want to do these things, but he wants to want to do it. There are really different parts, and in fact, 3 parts of the soul. So there are parts that are going to be responsible for desires, like the desire for the donut. There's another part that is going to be responsible for feeling a certain way about things, and another part that is going to think rationally about things. So basically, the 3 parts he identifies are reason, a rational element that thinks, desire, an appetitive element that wants, and then a spirited element, emotion, that feels. So our conflicts are basically, he says, conflicts between these 3 parts. Well, what about the case of the donut? Is Homer experiencing some sort of conflict there? It's easy to say there's the appetitive part, desire for the donut. Is there anything on the other side? Yeah. Maybe fear of actually having his soul claimed by the devil, in which case we'd say there's a conflict with the spirited element, emotion. Anything else? Yeah. Okay, reason, telling him it's not really a good trade to trade his soul for a donut. Now, here is the image of the soul that Plato gives us. He says, of the nature of the soul, though her true form be ever a theme of large and more than mortal discourse, let me speak briefly in a figure. Let the figure be composite. A pair of winged horses and a charioteer. Now the winged horses and the charioteers of the gods are all noble and of noble descent, but those of other races are mixed. The human charioteer drives his in a pair, and one of them is noble and of noble breed, the other is ignoble and of ignoble breed, and the driving of them of necessity gives a great deal of trouble to him. So here's a picture. One of these horses is well behaved. The other horse is poorly behaved and quite wild. And the charioteer is somebody who's trying to keep control. Well, these are the 3 parts of the soul. Intriguingly, there's almost exactly the same image in ancient Hindu thought, though what corresponds to what is slightly different. But here, what is in the chariot? The part driving, the part choosing. That's reason, exactly. What is the relatively noble horse, the one that's pretty well behaved, that usually allies with reason? Emotion, feeling. That's the part that basically thinks the way you feel about something and the way you think about it are closely related. They don't necessarily go together, but they often go together. They generally go together. However, desire, that's something that's pretty independent of reason. And so that's why he says it's not very well behaved. It's a matter of chance whether it ends up agreeing with reason. Yeah?
Would it be accurate to say that maybe when you are having a weak will, it's because you don't truly believe in that value, but it is valuable in your society, however, so you don't want to be excluded from that? It's not necessarily from you.
Well, okay, yeah. I mean, it might be that your sense that you ought to be doing such and such is something that comes from all sorts of different sources. It might be purely prudential. Like, I'm trying to lose weight for my own good. I don't think it's a moral obligation. I just think I'd be better off if I weighed less. And in which case, the desire for the donut conflicts with this purely prudential ought on the other side. It could be a moral ought. It could be just that you see other people around you doing a certain thing, and you try to conform yourself to what their expectations are. And so you think, wow, my teachers or my fellow students or my friends expect me to be doing such and such, and I don't really want to, but I, on the other hand, want to conform, and so I want to do that thing too. So that what's on the other side from desire could have many different sources, if that's what you're asking. It seems to me it's a sort of thing where reason is contemplating something, and it could be a moral thing that is really the good. It could be just the good for me. It could be just what people around me think is good, or treat as good, or something like that. Now, if we take a look at this, it implies that there are really three kinds of conflicts that we can have. It could be reason versus desire. It could be desire versus emotion. And it could be reason versus emotion. And of course, we can have multiple things going on at the same time. It might be that the desire for the donut conflicts with both a rational thought that it's not a very good trade, and also a feeling of fear that it might not be a good trade. And so, at one time, we might have multiple conflicts happening. But they're all, in the end, those three kinds. It's reason versus desire, desire versus emotion, or reason versus emotion. And in fact, we can easily see that by putting them in a diagram. Okay, we've got the three parts, reason, desire, and emotion. Then there are three sorts of conflicts that I've drawn in with the arrows. Now, okay, let's take an example of each of those. What is an example of a case that we haven't talked about yet of reason versus desire? What's such a conflict? Yeah.
You have unrealistic, like, goal you want to reach, so it's reasons not to do, so you need to make this more doable than desires. You want to get that extra thing, but it's not necessarily.
Okay, good. You might have some desire that just isn't realistic. It might be that, look, that it's just impossible, not going to happen. When I was a little kid, my goal was to grow up to become a pitcher in the starting rotation for the Pittsburgh Pirates. That was my deepest goal, my deepest desire. At some point, I realized that was never going to happen. Partly because I just couldn't throw fast enough, and partly because somebody hit a line drive and hit me right in the head. And that sort of messed up my baseball career. But anyway, that was a sort of case where I had this desire, but at some point you realize, yeah, that's not a realistic desire. And so the desire for this thing and the rational considerations against it go in opposite directions. It could be an unrealistic desire for another reason. It might be like, I love Brooke Shields. I'm sure she'll fall in love with me. And it's like, well, do you know Brooke Shields? No. But I know somebody who once met her at a party. It's like, yeah, that's not a realistic thing. And so reason's saying, forget it, while desire might be going in a different direction. What's an example of reason versus emotion? Yeah. Ooh, okay, yes. What about a case where you fall in love with somebody that reason is saying, yeah, this is never going to work out? Maybe, you know, it is some very long distance thing. Maybe it's like, actually, well, I won't mention any names, but I knew somebody who fell in love with some girl he met online who lived in the Middle East someplace. And I sort of said, look, I don't think this is going to work out. For one thing, you've never met her. I mean, for all you know, she could be a bus driver from Queens. But the other thing is, you know, she lives in Qatar or whatever. I mean, And you live in Georgia. What's happening here? And so it could be rational considerations competing with emotion in that way. What about desire versus emotion? Can that happen? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
You could love someone and can desire other people.
Oh, you could love somebody and desire other people. Yes, you're in love with this person, but, as the Stephen Stills song says, love the one you're with. It could be sort of that kind of thing, a temptation to cheat with desire versus emotion. The example Socrates gives is both more dramatic, but also really rarer. He gives a case, because a lot of people would say, in fact, Aristotle says, Paul says, it really comes down to two things. In Aristotle, it's the rational and the irrational. For Paul, it's spirit versus the flesh. Why does he distinguish desire and emotion here? In the end, Plato gives this example. Socrates says, I've heard about somebody who got separated from the army during a battle. And he was trying to find his way back to the main part of the troops. And to do that, he had to cross the battlefield after the battle to try to find his way home. And the battlefield was strewn with dead bodies. And he was going along feeling disgust at this, but also finding himself with this overwhelming desire to look at the dead bodies. And so he had been resisting it, disgusted by all of this, and finally he said, all right, you bastards, look at them! And forced himself to look at the bodies. Now in that case, Socrates says, look, it wasn't really a question of reason. There was this overwhelming desire to look, and yet this overwhelming revulsion at this. And it was that combination. You might experience on seeing a dead animal by the side of the road, or a car accident where there's all sorts of terrible stuff. We have this desire to look, even though also a very strong revulsion against it. Now, what is virtue here? He says it's a matter of rational control. Reason controlling the horses and making them do what reason wants them to do. Each part has to play its proper role. It's not a question of getting rid of desire, because desire is actually the horse that actually supplies all the energy that makes the chariot move. And so the rational element is not going to take over completely, but it does have to dominate. It has to direct. Somebody who gets into the chariot and just says, horses, go wherever you will, and drops the reins, is going to be in deep trouble. The driver has to control the horses. And so there's a goal of rationality here, but also a goal of balance. It's not only a question of the rational part being in command, but also of each part then playing its own proper function. Each part having a proper role to play, and then having a proper balance among the various parts of the soul. So each part of the soul has a role to play, and there end up being four cardinal virtues in this tradition. The excellence of the reason part, that is wisdom. The excellence of desire, that's self-control. The excellence of emotion, that's courage. And then the balance of all the other parts. And that's the virtue he describes as justice. So each part gets its own virtue, and then there's one about the proper balancing of all the other parts. And that image of the balance of the soul, I think, is very valuable. Well, in our last minute, I want to just talk about an objection. Augustine says in the Confessions, look, this is a very compelling idea, but actually, he says, there's a problem with it. Reasons can conflict with each other. So can desires. So can emotions. And the result of that is that there will end up being thousands of parts. When I asked you, first of all, for an example here, somebody said, here's my example, loving this person and also that person. That isn't actually a conflict between two different parts in Plato's scheme. That's a conflict within the desire part. Within the emotion part. And so the problem is desires can come into conflict. I can want different things, whether they're good or bad. Can feelings conflict? You bet. Here's a classic example from Catullus, Roman poetry. Oh yes, I hate and I love. Why, you ask? I don't know, but I feel it and I am in torment. And the same thing can even be true of reason. So in the end, he says, it's really not a matter of wanting to do something and not doing it. It's a matter of wanting something and not wanting to want. It's giving into a desire you don't want to have. That's weakness of will. All right, next time we'll start looking at Plato's theory of knowledge.